Welcome everyone to CGTN's BRICS Youth Talk, part of our coverage of the 15th BRICS Summit. I'm Michael Wong here in Beijing. Our topic today, the power of youth engagement in BRICS cooperation. Now, collectively, the BRICS nations of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa make up over 40% of the global population, and the BRICS mechanism, especially if it expands, can help certainly to create new opportunities for the younger generation in these developing economy giants. So joining our conversation today is Jeremy Stevens, a native of South Africa, who is the chief China economist at Standard Bank. That's South Africa's largest bank by assets. We're also joined by Angelina Ilina, a graduate student at Beijing International Chinese College. And here in the studio with me is our very own Yin Yue, former China Media Group Brazil correspondent. So, Yin Yue, Jeremy, Angelina, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to begin by giving our audience a basic self-introduction to all of you guys. So, Yin Yue, how about you? You've been in Brazil for quite a long time. Talk to us about your experience there.
No problem. Well, thanks for having me on the show, first of all. I'm born and bred Chinese, but then I went to Brazil to study, and then later I became a correspondent for CMG in Brazil, and it's been 5 years of my life there. So
5 years?
Yeah. Like pretty between China and Brazil, these two very important BRICS countries, and yeah, it's a very, very interesting experience for me.
Sounds good. So you've got that China connection, you've got the Brazil connection, in Brazil for 5 years. Do you have a favorite food in Brazil, by the way?
Oh my God.
Too many.
Yeah.
Too many to list.
we need an extra hour for this.
Extra hours. Got it. All right, thanks for that, Yin Yue. Angelina, let me come to you now. Talk to us a little bit more about yourself. How long have you been in China?
Well, I was studying before in China Petroleum University in Beijing doing my master's degree in Chinese and management. And now I wanted to come back after pandemic to China. I missed it that much. So I'm trying to improve my Chinese now, studying at the in the International Chinese College.
Okay. 那我要不测试一下您的这个中文。您的中文现在有多好 Angelina? I'm just trying to test Angelina in terms of how fluent she is in Chinese. Talk to our audience about how fluent you are in the language, because it's a difficult language to learn, Angelina. If we're going to see more people-to-people exchanges across BRICS nations, right, it'll be good to know the language of the member state.
我叫丽娜，我来自俄罗斯。现在我在北京国际汉语研修学院学习汉语，希望提高我的汉语水平。我自己觉得一步一步得到目的，所以呢，希望加油加油。
Okay, so I think your Chinese is probably better than mine, Angelina. Just FYI, it's quite fluent. All right, so for our audience, Angelina, you've certainly passed the test.
我还差得远呢。
Okay, she's saying that she can improve a little bit more, but already great Chinese skills. All right, thanks for that, Angelina. And Jeremy, over to you now. You've been here in China for quite a while also. Talk to us a little bit more about yourself.
我不会说中文，真的我说的不好，我不聪明，我觉得中文太难了。
Okay, hold on. We got to translate that for our audience as well, right? In terms of what you just said.
I hope I said that I can't speak Chinese very well. I'm not very clever and Chinese is too hard.
Okay,
but,
it's quite good pronunciation-wise.
Yeah, so professionally, I'll introduce just the professional side.
Yeah.
I'm from Cape Town, South Africa. I studied at UCT and then I moved to Johannesburg, did my master's and honors there, and then I was selected for the grad program for Standard Bank. Which is, like you say, Africa's biggest bank.
Yeah.
And I rotated around the investment bank, and because I had a master's in economics at the time, I was selected to be an economist, and then I started that and stayed there till 2011, and then in 2011, the bank needed someone to come and articulate African opportunities to Chinese investors, because we had this tie-up with ICBC. ICBC is our strategic partner. They bought 20% of Standard Bank, which at the time was the biggest outbound investment by a Chinese company. And so I do that, plus obviously articulate what's happening in the Chinese economy and how it matters to our African clients. So that's what I've been doing here since 2011, and I love it here, and life's good.
Yeah. And I think that China-Africa connection is only going to grow stronger because China is Africa's largest trading partner now for what, 14 straight years, that trading relationship stands at over $280 billion. And hopefully with the BRICS cooperation mechanism, and as more countries from the African continent join BRICS, we can see even more robust China-Africa economic ties. So let's talk about BRICS, the 15th BRICS Summit, because this has been billed as one of the most important summits since the first summit back in 2009, which was held in your home country of Russia, Angelina. And I just want to get the youth perspective here, your personal understanding of what BRICS is to you. Yin Yue, how about let me start with you and then I'll go around the table.
Sure. I think BRICS started out with this very technical definition of 5 or 4 emerging economies and joining forces together. But I think over the years, both in China and Brazil, what we witness is how young people are becoming more and more aware of this concept. I mean, a lot of young people want to study international relations because of the BRICS mechanism. This is a new thing. So I think we are really seeing that it's not just about emerging economies anymore. It's really about emerging generation, and people are seeing the world in a different order, and they want to be part of this order, and BRICS gives them this opportunity.
Yeah, great, the emerging generation. I mean, the young people of today, the leaders of tomorrow. Fantastic. Angelina, what about you? What does BRICS personally mean to you?
I would definitely agree. So BRICS stands for International Organization of 5 countries, which is, I don't want to say, we all know. And these countries are willing to cooperate with each other in fields of politics, economy, culture, innovations, in order to strengthen their position in the world. Okay.
And Jeremy, what about you?
So weirdly, when South Africa was invited by China to join, I actually got a call from the South African government the day before saying there's going to be this amazing announcement, look forward to blah, blah, blah. And the reason was because I'd spent a few years writing about BRICS in the sort of South Africa being invited phase. And really what the BRICS are is basically led by China. These big emerging markets sort of shattered global stereotypes. Until the mid-2000s, traditionally, the world was divided between developed and developing countries, and that had built-in assumptions about risk and return and opportunity and so on and so on. And these countries led by China particularly sort of reshaped trade and investment codes, and that was led by these ambitious global-minded corporates out of the BRICS. And since the global financial crisis, they outperformed. I think they grew sort of 6 times what the advanced economies expanded at an average rate. And now increasingly, they're looking to find ways to build an institutional underpinning to sort of propagate this relationship. And that came with the BRICS Bank first. And the goal is, I think, to elevate the voice of emerging markets in global discourse. And really, that's how I see what the BRICS are. It's a sort of champion for a new growth engine for the global economy.
Yeah, according to the IMF, already in purchasing power parity terms, the BRICS economies contribute more to global growth than the G7, and I think that gap is expected to widen even more. Jeremy, I want to stay with you because since this year's BRICS Summit is held in your home country of South Africa, I want to get your general sense of how BRICS as a mechanism, 15 summits on, I guess 14 summits on for South Africa. How is the BRICS mechanism perceived in South Africa right now?
So I do think that there was a slight waning in attention towards the BRICS sort of from 2015 to 2019. I think there was a lot of excitement before that, and then afterwards there was a little bit of these countries started to struggle. We realized that they weren't independent growth engines and they were part of an interconnected global community of countries, and yes, very important, but not able to be a sort of self-sustaining growth engine. But now, sort of as the geopolitical tensions rise, there's certainly more interest in what the BRICS are likely to achieve. And for what it's worth, I mean, South Africa is trying pretty hard not to be sort of anti-West or pro-West in their engagement. They're trying to be very neutral, and I think that that's quite smart. I mean, there's no real reason to align yourself to some anti-West conspiracy or to be pro. Really what you're trying to do is just find relationships that benefit your country and service the needs of your domestic agenda and regional agenda. And I do think that South Africa is a valuable contributor because despite the size discrepancy, South Africa is historically punched above its weight. We're in the G20, etc. We exist in a global community, and we think that the BRICS can play an important role led by South Africa in driving an African agenda, and that includes infrastructure and debt, sustainability, SMEs, job development, skills creation, intra-Africa trade, all of that about unlocking Africa's sort of structural growth opportunities in a way that sort of synchronize with what the BRICS themselves are looking to achieve. So it's a real opportunity for South Africa, and I think that's how most South Africans see the tie-up and the relationship.
Absolutely. Angelina, I want to come to you and get Russia's perspective in terms of how you think BRICS is perceived in Russia. Obviously, so many things have happened in the world since the first BRICS summit in 2009 in Ekaterinburg. What do you think, Angelina?
Well, as a personal thing, that BRICS members are definitely in favor of the formation of multipolar world, and is based on international law and respecting the key principles of the UN Charter, including the sovereign right and respect of the right of every people to their own development. So people should choose their own way of development. How do they want to develop their country? What is the model for that? And BRICS is perceived as an organization that is against of any kind of hegemony and based on the policy of continuing neocolonialism. So we could say that the participants strengthen cooperation in the diversification of supply chains, de-dollarization, and the transition to national currencies. For example, we can do trades between China and Russia, and we can use different currencies such as yuan or Russian ruble. So it's all benefits us together in our mutual settlements. Also, the digital economy support for small and big enterprises and fair technology transfer.
Gotcha. And then Yin Yue, of course, what do you think from the China perspective?
Well, I think in China, BRICS is actually called the Golden BRICS. I think that's pretty self-explanatory already. But I think what it means to call it Golden BRICS is really more about how people today view the global order. That we see that in this multilateral world, you have to find your friends and to develop with, but it doesn't mean that we're anti anyone, like Jeremy said. So I think in China, BRICS has become a part of the worldview for today's young people here, and I can say the same thing about Brazil as well. So it's really, the golden brick and its implication.
Yeah. Actually, Jeremy, I'm going to ask you about this term that's floating around, de-dollarization, and then the use of local currencies in a second. But Yin Yue, I want to stick with you. In terms of a youth perspective, because we do have youth summits at the BRICS, but what else do you think young people can do in these 5 countries and later more countries? What else can the younger generation do to really raise the profile of this mechanism? Because like we all know, this is still quite young, right? It first was an acronym started by Goldman Sachs economists back in the beginning of the new millennium, and now it's sort of formed into a political, financial, economic grouping. So what more can the younger generation do to raise the profile of BRICS?
Well, I think I don't try to think it as what young people can do more. I think as what this mechanism can do more to empower young people to do more. And I think this empowerment shouldn't be an annual thing. It's not like once per year during summit thing. It actually should be more daily and conversational. I think from my experience in both China and Brazil, I think young people today really have a very strong point of view that they form through their education in a very globalized period of the global history. So I think it's going to be very unique in terms of what value they can bring to the global discussion, because instead of the point of view from a developed country, developing country, the young people in these areas, they have a different way of approaching things that sometimes could benefit global development in a different way. So I think, first of all, the BRICS mechanism should recognize that its youth has huge potential in terms of global development, and then really empower the people to be able to do more and really play their role in on the global stage.
Yeah, and Angelina, you were nodding your head when Yin Yue was going through his answer on this front. I mean, do you agree? Geographically, the distances are very long, right, between the BRICS nations, but Chinese President Xi Jinping at this year's BRICS summit also saying that we need to deepen people-to-people exchanges between these 5 nations right now, and we do, right? We do need more cultural and more people-to-people exchanges. What do you think, Angelina?
Oh, well, I totally agree with that. We need the cultural exchange too. We need to build good connections between our countries. to have a sustainable and peaceful development and great future for BRICS countries and other countries. Exactly.
Jeremy,
and talking more about the profile of BRICS among the youth. I could say that we could also promote in the BRICS in the social networks, like the online platforms that young people use a lot now. We can make some videos in TikTok and spread the BRICS also there, and Facebook, Twitter, and some Chinese social networks, so people can be informed about what like BRICS really does, and involve young people in the events of BRICS.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Jeremy, if you want to add on or follow up to anything that Yin Yue or Angelina said, feel free. But I do want to ask you about the financial aspect of, let's say, de-dollarization in local currencies, because you are an economist. I want to get your take on the significance of perhaps BRICS using more local currencies when it comes to global trade, because the BRICS bank that you were referring to, the New Development Bank, aiming, I guess, to have local currency lending reach about 30% when it comes to 2026. And just before the summit began, I believe the BRICS Bank raised its first ever South African rand bond to the tune of 1.5 billion rands. So what do you think are the implications of stronger local currency trading among BRICS members? Is that going to be a hallmark, a defining feature of the group? And does that necessarily mean de-dollarization, or just simply a diversification of the global monetary system?
Yeah, so there's no doubt that there's pressure on the Bretton Woods system to become more adaptable to reflect the interests of a sort of growingly vociferous global south. And one of the things that we know is that the status quo for these Bretton Woods institutions can no longer be maintained. And so there is going to be reform and adjustments, both in terms of the policy flexibility within those institutions, but also, exactly like you said, a sort of more heterogeneous position of global currencies. And I think that with the BRICS, like where the danger is when you're working with 5 countries that are diverse and different. Sometimes when you're looking for a common denominator, it's quite difficult. And so it can really end up with you have sort of nothing that's significant because you're trying to please everybody. And I think that what the BRICS are trying to do is they're trying to find areas where they can deeply integrate and work together with one another in areas where there is a clear common purpose or a consensus. And one of them is this desire to use more of their own currencies in their interactions in terms of transactions, trade and investments, and raising debt, and eventually maybe holding assets in their own currencies. And so they're exploring ways and mechanisms to do that. Now, it's utterly justified. If you look at global transactions, there's 4 currencies that basically account for 75% of global transactions, and that's only declined 5 percentage points in the last decade. So this idea that there's de-dollarization happening, it's pretty slow if it's happening at all. Of the BRICS, when you look at their relative role in global trade, their relative role in global GDP, only South Africa's rand trades at a level consistent with those metrics. So China, for example, it's about 4.5% of transactions are done in renminbi, but they're almost 20% of world's GDP, 16% of the world's trade. So, and Russia's even worse, and then India and Brazil are both also underweight in their global transactions. So I think that this is something that all the countries are keen to do, and we know that for China specifically, internationalizing the renminbi is back in vogue since the pandemic. It sort of was stalled from 2015 to 2019 after the deval of the currency and a sort of more bi-directional flow. But now, in the last couple of years, we are seeing a significant rise in the renminbi usage in its own trade. So, for example, I think 50% of China's trade in the first 6 months of the year this year was done with renminbi. So an easy win is obviously to find pathways and mechanisms for them to trade and transact directly with one another. The real question is, when will Brazil start paying for imports from South Africa using renminbi, for example? When the countries can start to be using sort of a second and third country can be using the currencies of these countries, that's, I think, when we're really going to move the dial. And I think that that's the low-hanging fruit, and that's on the agenda for this event, and we should expect some concrete policy support this year.
Yeah. what I found interesting was that Argentina, who is also interested in joining the BRICS grouping, actually paid off part of its IMF loan in the Chinese yuan. So I guess the dial is moving a little bit on that front. I want to bring it back to a larger picture again, Yin Yue. From a youth perspective, what is the one big problem that you hope the BRICS mechanism can eventually solve? Because this obviously, I think, is a relatively new phenomenon, right? Where a collection of influential and powerful developing economies have come together, and perhaps they will have a different view of the world. Obviously, they will have a different view in terms of the global order and what are the priorities when it comes to the world that we live in. So from your perspective, what is the one big issue that you want BRICS to tackle?
I really think that the BRICS countries combining their forces, the problem that really should address is the lack of voice for emerging economies on the global stage. Because what we're seeing is that a lot of global discussions happen in a very structural way, in the sense that the opinions are determined by certain parties or determined by certain cultures, and then in emerging markets, people just accept that. But I think, for the past, I would say like 5 to 10 years, what we really see, we have been seeing in both China and Brazil, is that people are more aware of their own identity. We see that in the art industry, we see that in the movie industry, in the fashion industry, that people are just more and more proud of their own identity. I think that's, it coincides with what BRICS has been, developing in terms of combining their forces and taking their place in the world. So I think from a really global perspective, we have these 5 emerging economies with huge influence on the continent that they're in, joining forces on global stage, and I think it should fill a void that has been there and no one was actually addressing it.
Okay. I love asking these big questions.
I love answering them too.
And I want to get everybody's perspective on this from different geographies. Same question to you, Angelina. So Yin Yue's answer was about, of course, amplifying the voices of the Global South. That is one thing that he wants to see. And of course, according to the UN, there are, over 150 developing economies in the world. So the vast majority of the world's population and the fastest growing population centers in the world are in developing economies. So feel free to have the same answer or a different answer to Yin Yue. Angelina, what do you think?
Well, I definitely think that we cannot choose only one problem that we need to stick to. We can talk about different issues such as environmental issues and also economic issues. But as for me, I personally think that I represent the youth, so I would say that we need to focus that the standards of education that we give to young leaders, that these standards of education also fit the market requirement when young people trying to find the jobs. So this standard of education fit the market requirement, and also to diminish the poverty in BRICS countries so that everyone has a lot of job opportunities.
Fantastic. So education and poverty on your side, Angelina, and then Jeremy, what about you?
Yeah, so I agree with everybody. I think that all the sort of questions around sustainable development that are going on today in the sort of global community require engagement with the Global South and developing countries. For example, you're not going to be able to sort of tackle environmental issues without getting the buy-in of the sort of poorer, less developed parts of the world. So you have to be engaging with them. And I do hope that with the BRICS forum and the BRICS discussion, I want to see it translated, the partnership between the countries to be translated into practical solutions to whatever problems it is that each of the BRICS want to be solving. I think each BRIC member needs to find ways to basically attach the membership to the resolution of whether they domestic or regional problems. And I think that's the way you win the hearts and minds of the youth. And in South Africa, for example, we've got 40% unemployment. A lot of youth, so if you're under the age of 30, you've maybe never had a job in your life. And you're not that well equipped for this increasingly competitive global environment. Now, South Africa has to prioritize solving the job crisis in South Africa. That has to be every forum we're in, that's the focal point. Now, I hope that we can find ways and means to use the partnership with the BRICS to solve that problem in a South African context. And China has its own version, and Brazil has its own version, and India has its own version. And I think that's going to be the real way that this group fundamentally sort of wins the hearts and minds of the youth.
Okay. Some of you touched upon climate and the environment. I want to come back to that in just a second. But before that, I want to talk about science and technology, because I feel like, the hot topic today, generative AI, of course, we talk about this all the time, but how do we see, I guess, more diffusion of technology within BRICS, right? If we have such advanced technology in sort of the richer economies, we got to make sure that emerging and developing economies are not left behind, because at the rate that it's going right now, I feel that gap is just going to get wider and wider. So do you see, I guess, the BRICS mechanism being able to spur more science and technology cooperation? I think I'm heartened at this year's BRICS summit, Chinese President Xi Jinping saying that China will now create what's called a China BRICS Science and Innovation Incubation Park for the new era. And there's already a new Industrial Revolution Center down in Xiamen that was created after the 9th BRICS Summit here in China in 2017. So we should see more technology and innovation cooperation between the BRICS, I feel. What do you think?
Absolutely. I think you just answered your own question in terms of how BRICS countries are already doing this sort of boost to scientific and technological cooperation. And I think from my perspective, I've seen huge technological boost in China in terms of how technology is going to the application side of technology. It's not just sending people to the moon. It's actually how can normal lives benefit from technology. And it's the same thing in Brazil. And I think one thing that's very particular that's drawn my attention is how young people in both of these developing countries have this very natural and pure curiosity about the world that they can build so that the future generations can live in. I think in terms of social media, we see both Chinese social media companies and Brazilian users are really trying to adapt different features into different markets, and I think that's a very interesting way for us to observe how the scientific cooperation can actually develop in a business sense, in a commercial sense, and in a more daily sense. So I definitely agree that the BRICS mechanism is going to help with this kind of innovation.
Yeah. And that can help, I think, with education as well, right, in terms of narrowing the education gap and when it comes to productivity gap as well. I want to talk about climate change because the industrialized economies obviously previously have emitted the most carbon, but now many of the large developing economies such as China, such as India, are some of the largest carbon emitters in the world. China, of course, has a very ambitious plan in terms of peaking carbon emissions by 2030 and then carbon neutrality by 2060. Jeremy, I want to come to you on this in terms of how you see the BRICS can come together to really spur climate change, because the developing economies, I guess, have expected more from richer countries to help them with mitigation and adaptation when it comes to climate change. And many of these developing economies, especially in Africa, are the most vulnerable when we see climate change. So can BRICS play a bigger role in terms of supporting our global fight against extreme weather and climate change?
Well, that's the hope, right?
Yeah.
So when I talk to the mining companies in Africa, really what they're trying to do is they're trying to position themselves as enablers of the green transition. So they really are investing in technology to make the stuff that they extract from the earth more and more competitive. More and more clean, more and more environmentally friendly. So that's clear, and that was sort of a unanimous consensus in the engagements I had with the clients in April. China's obviously a leader in the field. Brazil's also a leader in the field, and they offer tremendous learnings for BRICS and the global community in terms of how can we address climate challenges. And like you've made the point, Africa's sort of particularly vulnerable because we've got such a big catch up in terms of our growth that we still need to achieve, and our urbanization and industrialization. And in reality, our infrastructure is bursting at the seams and we need far more of it. We need power. South Africa is going through rolling blackouts as we speak. So getting this right is going to be very difficult, and hopefully we can lean on the experience of these large emerging markets to try aid us to that end. But it sort of goes back to the fear that you mentioned with regards to tech as well. A lot of these technologies, on the one hand, they offer tremendous opportunities and productivity and competitiveness, but at the same time, when you fall behind the curve, there becomes quite a significant performance gap. So you can imagine you're a small mining company in South Africa and you want to export your product to Europe, but you can't because you don't fit certain green requirements that the client needs to import those commodities from that country. So then suddenly you don't have a market for your goods. So it's very difficult. And it's something that we have to work very hard at trying to address together collectively, because I don't think any country can do it on their own.
Yeah. Angelina, I'm curious as to how concerned are you about the technology gap, because Russia traditionally has been a technological powerhouse. Right now, things are maybe a little bit tricky on the geopolitical front. Are you concerned at all about Russia maybe falling behind when it comes to technological development?
Well, I don't think that Russia is totally behind. We are also having a lot of scientific research that we are doing right now. And I hope that our both countries, China and Russia and all BRICS countries, are willing to support each other and to exchange new knowledge and innovation, because we are all one, and we need to help each other to cope with the same problems that we're having.
Yeah. Yeah, what about you? How do you think the BRICS nations can better prepare their workforce for the future, especially with AI? We could see long-term productivity gains, which can raise living standards, can raise incomes, but short-term there could be job displacements, right? So how do you reskill your workforce? I think that is something that a lot of companies are trying to work on. Is there anything the BRICS mechanism can do in terms of preparing our workforces better for the new industrial age?
Well, obviously, I think I'm with a lot of people who don't agree that AI is a threat to jobs, although there is going to be some restructure. But it was the same with the industrial revolutions, before that it eliminated certain jobs, but then people were able to get educated again and find other jobs, and the human society evolved as a result of that. So I really don't think that AI is something that people need to prepare against. It's actually to prepare how to embrace that. And I think that's especially what BRICS countries should do.
1 second though, but many of the top AI scientists, and we also have, I guess, luminaries such as Elon Musk, basically characterizing AI as sort of an existential threat to humanity if not properly controlled. You don't share that view, well, obviously. I mean, China, this environment, because already we see many AI applications, mobile phones, etc., e-commerce, but you don't share that view.
Well, I seem to remember Elon Musk has said that human civilization is a transitional culture, that our meaning in life, the meaning of our existence is to activate the silicon-based computers, AIs, so that they can actually be in this world. I do, think about that view a lot, but just from, my perspective and daily perspective, when I was in the United States, when I was in Brazil, I used GPT to do a lot of things. I do feel that my productivity enhanced significantly because of that. And I think this small factor can actually play into the workplace in many different ways. I think instead of really worrying about whether, AI is going to, erase our existence on Earth, we should think more about climate change or the things that we're doing to the planet that can actually cause a more, horrifying result to the place that we live in. But AI can actually be a force for good. So obviously, I think everyone can have their own opinion, but at the end of the day, it's how we use the technology that we have that matters.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, if we combine quantum with AI, that can also help to solve some of our major climate challenges as well. Jeremy, I want to come to you in terms of how concerned are you about the workforce? There is obviously a gap between advanced economies and developing economies, especially where technology is going today. Are you concerned about, let me ask it this way, how concerned are you on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of developing economies and emerging economies' workforce is really falling behind in the age of technology that we are currently going through?
I'm worried. Let's say 7, if 10's the most crisis. Yeah. But I don't disagree with what Yin Yue said. We don't know what jobs are going to be there in the future, and AI creates significant amounts of jobs and allows people to sort of stop working in cubicles, and those can be taken over by something else, and we can get in sort of creative areas. Importantly, to embrace tech, though, you need certain prerequisites. You need agile SMEs, you need sort of specific kinds of knowledge, you need data access, you need real-time data, you need financial capacity to support, you need adaptive business strategies, and then importantly, your education system has to be able to create workers that are adjusting for that future world. And I think that in South Africa's context, you've got 40% unemployment. A lot of them are low skilled. They're vulnerable. And like you say, I mean, are we equipping our people and our youth for what the world's going to look like in 20, 30 years? I would say right now, no. So that's why I'm a 7. But I'm not sort of fatalist in the terms of it can't be done. But you need a whole of society response, kind of like in China's sort of quest for tech self-sufficiency. They created a party commission in the ministry to coordinate a whole of society response. We need that kind of initiative in our education system that includes all primary schools and middle schools and high schools and universities and business schools, and it's integrated across all ministries, and it's got private sector support, and they're creating business schools and think tanks and dedicating some of their profits to building or financing training schemes. It needs to be that kind of attitude that the whole of South African society has to try and prepare the youth for what will be a disruptive AI technological transformation. If you get that right, you can flourish. If you get it wrong, the gap's getting bigger, not smaller, because it's happening here, it's happening in advanced economies, and that catch-up potential, that hit to your productivity and your competitiveness is too severe. So that's why I worry.
Yeah. Hopefully we don't see these lost generations, right, in developing economies as technology continues to improve. And at this year's BRICS Summit, there is the creation of an AI study group. And like you mentioned, Jeremy, hopefully the policy then translates into actual concrete results on the ground. And perhaps we can talk about entrepreneurship as well in terms of really spurring development in these developing economies. Yin Yue, I want to come to you. Do you get the sense right now when you're in Brazil in terms of how much does the Brazilian population understand the China market? So when we're talking about these large developing economies, there are opportunities as these countries continue to grow. Can BRICS as a mechanism, you think, try and raise the profile of investing in each other's countries? Where if I'm a Brazilian business, I can go invest in the vast Chinese market, Chinese entrepreneurs investing more in South Africa, investing more in Russia, in India, et cetera. Do you think there should be a higher profile when it comes to entrepreneurship among BRICS?
I think so. I think what we've seen in both China and Brazil is that young people today, I can't tell you how many of my friends have said they want to quit their job and to become an entrepreneur, and it's the same thing in Brazil as well. There's actually a very famous research by Professor Engelhardt in terms of post-materialist value. In normal way of speaking, it's about when young people grow up in a material abundant background, they tend to focus more on self-fulfillment. And I think that's exactly what we see across the BRICS countries, in terms of young people who were born, along with this economic boom. So nowadays, I think it's more than natural that young people in these 5 countries would choose to, do something on their own and to fulfill their value. And obviously, logically, they will have to think about the markets they're going to invest in. And just like we covered before, what we notice is that BRICS countries are sort of taking on their own identity instead of following other people's, aesthetics. So I think it creates this sort of diversification in terms of markets. In social media business, people say it vertical, which means that you just focus on the content you create. And I think this kind of vertical concept is going to be a new kind of market across BRICS countries, because young people everywhere, they love sort of the same things. And it sort of eliminates the country borders, and obviously it connects the markets as well.
Yeah. Angelina, what about your friends back home? Are they thinking about perhaps doing business here in China? I'll give you one example. So I've been to the China International Import Expo, the CIIE, and every single year that I'm there, something that is super popular is this ice cream brand you have in Russia. I don't remember what it's called, but every year I'm at the CIIE in Shanghai, I see absolutely crazy long lines of people just standing to buy the Russian ice cream. And the Russian pavilion, I think, is always popular among Chinese consumers. So obviously, if you find that niche area where you're good at, the Chinese consumer, they're willing to open their wallets, right? And you see that at an expo like the CIIE, where there are huge lines for certain brands. What do you think? What are you hearing from your friends back home in terms of how they think about the Chinese market and potentially starting a business to sell to the Chinese consumer?
Well, actually, there's a great potential working both ways, because many Russian people, they're actually doing business trade with China. So they just go to the main Chinese platforms such as Alibaba, and they talk with the different 供应商.
Okay,
They
that's
talk,
suppliers, I
yeah.
guess. Suppliers and vendors.
Suppliers, right?
Yeah.
Suppliers, and they just want to buy these goods, and they just sell it on the Russian also markets. The same as Taobao, that is called Wildberries or Ozon. So this is also great potential that you can buy different goods and you can sell it in Russia. That could be cheaper for you because we don't produce such a lot of things as China do.
I want to bring it back once again to a higher level and talk about something that everybody has been talking about on this panel so far, and that's creating a stronger voice for the global South. Because again, these countries are where the population centers are. And I just want to get your take, Yin Yue, in terms of how big of an influence do you think BRICS can actually be, even if we see stronger expanded membership for BRICS? How strong of a voice can this grouping actually be for the global South?
Well, I think how strong a voice can be is not doesn't depend on how loud the countries are, but actually depend on how influential they can be together.
Words of wisdom from you all the time.
Well, it's actually how I feel. Thank you for that. But I really think that. But I think the fact that we're in a time where globalization is being considered as something that's been shrinking, where there are rising sentiment against globalization. But the fact that the BRICS is actually considering expanding its membership and it's being able to maintain its criteria is a statement that this mechanism is actually growing. So I think in terms of boosting South-South cooperation or South-South development, what matters the most is how much these countries can bring together their own comparative advantages and really form alliances between them. It's very much like how countries started to trade with each other. I think these 5 countries have a lot of complementarity, economic complementarity between them, cultural complementarity between them. Actually, there is a tool called Half-State Comparison Tool that compares, which country is more individual, which country is more risk aversion. And if you put these 5 countries together, the BRICS countries together, you see a lot of complementarity in every category. This means that when you combine these 5 markets, these 5 ways of doing things together, you have a group that basically is strong in every indication. And I think if we think these 5 countries as 5 employees on a firm level, you actually have a lot of diversity in that. And business research have proved that the more diversity you have in a team, more productive they are and more, risk tolerant they are. So I think the combination of the BRICS force is actually, itself is powerful enough to really boost development.
Okay. I want to get one last question about what BRICS means for Africa from Jeremy in a second, but Angelina, I want to come to you first in terms of, do you have anything more to add to what Yin Yue just said in terms of what BRICS can really do to amplify the voices of the global South?
No, I don't have anything new. I agree, and I don't
Okay.
I don't have anything new to say.
Complementarity.
Fair enough. Complementarity. Okay, Jeremy. I mean, again, the BRICS summit this year is in your home country of South Africa, and we always talk about what BRICS can do for, I guess, the African continent. But in terms of more African engagement towards the BRICS, what do you think that might mean? Because we're seeing Algeria, for example, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Egypt, all interested in joining the BRICS. So what does stronger Africa engagement towards BRICS mean for the BRICS, you think?
Well, I sat with the ambassador here a couple of weeks ago, just before he went to South Africa, and he said that President Ramaphosa was spending time with Nigeria and Kenya and a couple of other African leaders in preparation for the BRICS summit. And that was sort of music to my ears, because for me, competitiveness for South Africa and for Africa really depends on us having our own solutions to our own problems, being able to prioritize those, and then to engage with our bilateral and multilateral partners to say, these are our priorities, this is what we want to focus on, can you help us with this, 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 and this, this is bankable, this is feasible. And that was music to my ears, because it seems to me that they are prioritizing a sort of an African position as it relates to BRICS, and then South Africa is trying to push that agenda through, which is great. And it is one of the 5 themes for this year's event is Africa. I do think that we need BRICS firms to set up more capacity in Africa, and preferably in South Africa, because I do make the case that if, for example, Chinese manufacturing capacity sets up in Nigeria, instead of South Africa, it will cut South Africa out of the growth in intra-Africa trade, because essentially South Africa needs to be a conduit for intra-Africa trade. We know that intra-Africa trade tends to be more manufacturing heavy. So 40% of intra-Africa trade is manufacturing, whereas almost none of our exports to the rest of the world are manufacturing. So what I'm hoping, and what our team here in Beijing, for example, does on a daily basis, is basically look at specific markets, specific cities, specific products, specific firms that China is already exporting to Africa, and then we engage with them to see if they're willing to or explore opportunities to set up capacity. We need that capacity in Africa, and a lot of interest in Africa is there because, for example, Latin America's consumption is expected to rise by $1 trillion over the next five or 6 years. Sub-Saharan Africa is expected to grow by almost 2. So there's a lot of opportunity. There's a rising middle class. There's significant opportunities. Some of the fastest growing markets for China are in Africa. We need to find ways and pathways to get them to set up capacity close to those end markets to then service intra-Africa trade. And that has to be South Africa's goal in the BRICS. And that with that then obviously comes supply chain ecosystems and infrastructure developments and port infrastructure and so on that needs to then accompany that kind of development plan. But I think that's what we're working towards and trying to use the BRICS platform to that end. And I think that's why it's one of the 5 themes for this year's event.
Got it. Okay, we're just about out of time, but I want to end this conversation on a bit of a lighter note. And I want to ask each of you, what is one misperception do you think about your country that you want the world to know? Yin Yue, how about, let me start with you.
That fortune cookie is not a Chinese thing.
That fortune cookies are not a Chinese
I get asked a lot, what is it like to grow up full of fortune cookie notes? I was like, what?
I think that's an American invention.
I think
right?
so. I think
fortune
so.
cookies are not.
But the first time I had it was in Brazil, so.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Angelina, what about you?
Well, I think that many people have this stereotype about Russian people and perception that they are very serious and they never smile and they're not friendly. So it's not that, guys. We're really welcoming and we're friendly people. Welcome to our country. Yeah.
You've been smiling this whole time, Angelina, so you're definitely, I think, a very friendly person. All of our colleagues here at CGTN are Russian colleagues, very friendly people. Jeremy, what about you?
South Africans really aren't friendly at all. We're very aggressive. No, the thing I always get asked, are there animals on the streets in South Africa? And often by taxi drivers in China. So obviously not. That's the one misconception. But the real one is that South Africa, and this is, I mean, it's a bit serious, but South Africa, we're not always the junior partner in all respects as it relates to BRICS. In fact, a South African company owns 30% of Tencent.
Yeah.
That's reality. We've got far deeper capital markets. We've got very sophisticated banks. We've got a very sophisticated financial sector. We've got an incredible regulatory apparatus. As I've said already, the Rand's traded. It's one of the most traded emerging market currencies in the world. And most of the trades are offshore to offshore. So really, we've got experience and learnings. And a lot of our companies are very competitive and sophisticated. And I do think that the message is South Africa needs to understand, reflect on its strengths, and exaggerate those strengths to then bring them to the table to negotiate clearly for what they want from these relationships. Because make no mistake, and I do say this all the time to African policymakers, when you go into an engagement with the Chinese side, they are prepared. They know what they want from this engagement. So African leaders and African policymakers in South Africa, we need to be clear about what we want, how we want it, and be forceful and forthright in saying exactly what that is.
Yeah.
In an aggressive way, because South Africans are obviously very aggressive.
Got it. Love the South African humor in the wit, though. That is, I think, absolutely fantastic. I think a lot of people around the world have heard of the cities of Beijing, of Shanghai, for example, of Hong Kong, and Guangzhou, Shenzhen. If someone were trying to visit China for the first time, give them a city that you think they should go to.
Beijing.
Beijing.
The best.
You're
I'm biased.
Beijing, a city other than Beijing, other than your
biased.
hometown. Which city would you recommend?
Yeah, I think I can't really give one city because China is so diverse. I think
And
like
it's big,
many,
yeah.
many BRICS countries. But just come,
Okay,
I think
to
as long as
Beijing.
people come,
Right.
People are going to learn more about different cultures.
Okay, then which dish are you going to recommend here in China? Your favorite Chinese dish? Don't say Peking duck.
No, it's not. It's good, but it's not anymore my favorite. I had something called cherry stuffed with foie gras.
Cherry stuffed with foie gras does not sound very Chinese.
It's a combination of China and the world. I think it's very symbolic, but it's very good. It's very good. It tastes very, very well in winter, especially.
Okay. Angelina, besides Moscow and St. Petersburg, give us another city that we should go visit in Russia and your favorite Russian dish.
Okay, first, my favorite Russian dish is solyanka. Because Russian people will like different soups. Everyone knows borscht, which is made from beetroot, but solyanka is another soup. And as you know, it's winter, it's freezing, so it's very good to eat a warm soup. And the city, apart from Moscow and St. Petersburg, I would recommend definitely to go to the Golden Ring cities that are close to Moscow. For example, Suzdal. It also has a small Kremlin, so you can go and see the architecture there. It's very nice.
Sounds fantastic. What is the soup called again? Salyanka.
Solyanka.
Salyanka.
Yeah.
What is that made of?
It is made from meat and pickled preserved vegetables.
Okay.
Or it can be made from fish and mushrooms. There are 3 types of solyanka. You can choose which one you like.
Okay. Well, there's a very good Russian restaurant near the office where we are right now, so maybe after this program, I'm going to go check it out and see if they have this soup. Good stuff. Jeremy, what about you? One city that you would recommend in South Africa, maybe off the beaten path a little bit, and then your favorite South African dish.
I would just say that go for the seafood and mushroom Russian one. I think that sounds better. No, off the beaten path, Hermanus, you can sort of go about 100 kilometers from Cape Town. Or Knysna, you can have mussels, you can have all sorts of seafood there. I mean, South Africa is obviously a coastal place, amazing wines. We've got amazing ingredients, very fresh, very high quality. So there's a lot. And interestingly, because we've got Indian influence and Portuguese influence and Malaysian influence and Dutch influence, we've got quite an eclectic national diet. So there's lots of choices. And I would just say, I really loved visiting Wuhan and eating ragan mian for breakfast. I think that's pretty dope. I like mian. I'm quite into noodles. So I think that's south of China. So I'm more that guy.
Hold on a second, Jeremy. Which kind of noodles did you have in Wuhan? The dry, hot noodles, you said, right?
Yeah, ragan mian.
The what?
Ragan mian.
Okay, all right, yeah. So, okay, that's a breakfast staple in Wuhan. Okay, very delicious. Totally agree.
Love it. Yeah, love it. But like Yin Yue said, it's too diverse here. I mean, they always ask me, like, if you could only have 3 countries' foods for the rest of your life, which ones would they be? And China's always one, because if you have Chinese food, it's basically everything. There's so much. It's mad. So China's incredible.
A lot of different flavors in this country to explore.
Oh, yeah.
All right, sounds like we all need to take a vacation soon and visit each other's countries. So fantastic conversation, guys, very enlightening, but we're gonna have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on this BRICS Youth Talk. Our thanks to Yin Yue, our former Brazil correspondent from China Media Group, Jeremy Stevens, who is the chief China economist at Standard Bank, and Angelina Ilina, a graduate student at Beijing International Chinese College. I'm Michael Wong here in Beijing. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you again next time. Bye for now.